There is something deep inside the human mind that has always been afraid of the dark. Not just the darkness outside the window or the darkness at the edge of a forest, but something older than that. A fear that lives in a place words can barely reach. A fear that the line between human and animal, between the person who thinks, who speaks, who loves, who grieves, and the creature that hunts, that kills, that feels nothing but hunger, is not as solid as we want to believe. For thousands of years, across dozens of cultures, on almost every continent on Earth, human beings have told a particular kind of story. A story about a person who becomes a wolf. Or something like a wolf. Something that walks on 2 legs during the day and on 4 legs at night. Something that wears a human face in the sunlight and a muzzle full of teeth in the dark. Something that remembers being a person, or perhaps has forgotten entirely. Something that kills. We call this figure the werewolf. The word itself comes from Old English. Wer meant man. Wolf meant wolf. A man-wolf. A wolf-man. The compound appears in English texts going back more than 1,000 years, but the idea it names is far older than the word. Older, in fact, than the English language itself. Older than Christianity. Older than the Roman Empire. Older than almost any institution or belief system that we might point to today and call ancient. The werewolf, as a concept, as a category of being, as a shape that human fear takes when it looks at the world and sees danger in the human form itself, is one of the most durable ideas in recorded human history. Unlike many monsters which belong to specific cultures or specific periods of time, the werewolf appears again and again, in places that had no contact with each other, in texts written by people who could not read each other's languages, in court records and church documents and medical case files and anthropological field notes. It keeps showing up, century after century, continent after continent. This is not a coincidence. And scholars who have spent their careers studying folklore, history, anthropology, and psychology have developed serious and careful explanations for why this particular idea, of the human who becomes a predatory animal, has never gone away. What this documentary will do is trace the werewolf through the historical record itself. Not through horror films. Not through novels. Not through legend told as entertainment. But through the actual documents that survive. The trial transcripts of men and women who confess to being werewolves, some willingly, some under torture. The theological arguments of priests and bishops who debated whether such transformation was even possible. The medical case studies of doctors who treated patients who genuinely believed they were wolves. The anthropological accounts of cultures where the ability to become an animal was not a curse but a gift, not evidence of evil but of spiritual power. This is the real history of the werewolf. And it is darker, stranger, and more deeply human than any fictional version of the story has ever managed to be. To find the first werewolf in the historical record, we have to go back a very long way. Not to medieval Europe, which is where most people tend to start when they think of witch trials and monster myths. Not even to ancient Rome, though Rome gives us some of the most detailed early accounts. We have to go further back than that. Back to the ancient Near East. Back to some of the oldest pieces of writing that human beings have ever produced. The Epic of Gilgamesh is one of the oldest surviving works of written literature in the world. It was composed in ancient Mesopotamia, the region that is today roughly the country of Iraq, and its earliest written versions date to approximately 2100 BCE, though the stories it tells are believed to be even older than that. The epic survives on cuneiform tablets, pressed into clay and baked hard, discovered by archaeologists in the ruins of ancient cities. In one passage of this poem, the hero Gilgamesh confronts the goddess Ishtar, and in making his argument against her, he lists the ways in which she has punished and destroyed her former lovers. Among those punishments he describes how she turned a shepherd, a man who had devoted his life to her service, into a wolf. Because of this transformation, the text tells us, the man's own herd dogs turned against him. His own boys, the young shepherds who had worked alongside him, now hunted him as an enemy. This is not a werewolf story in the sense that would be recognizable from later European traditions. There is no full moon. There is no night transformation followed by a return to human form at dawn. There is no murderous rampage through a village. But what the passage does contain is something of enormous importance to the history of the idea. The concept that a divine power can impose animal nature upon a human being as a punishment, and that this transformation does not merely change the body. It changes the person's entire relationship to the world. The man who was a shepherd becomes prey to his own flock. He is cast out. He is hunted. He belongs to neither the human world nor the animal world fully. He is something in between. That sense of the in-between, of the creature that is neither fully human nor fully animal, that is excluded from the communities of both, will echo through werewolf mythology for the next 4,000 years. Moving from ancient Mesopotamia to ancient Greece, the werewolf tradition becomes more explicit, more detailed, and for the first time names a specific individual whose transformation is treated as a historical or mythological fact. The story of Lycaon, king of Arcadia, is the most famous werewolf origin story in the ancient Western world. It is recounted in several ancient Greek sources, but the most complete and influential version appears in the Metamorphoses of the Roman poet Ovid, written around 8 CE. In Ovid's telling, the god Zeus, called Jupiter by the Romans, descends to earth in human form after hearing disturbing reports about the state of humanity. Lycaon, the king of Arcadia in the Greek Peloponnese, is said to have been a man of legendary cruelty and impiety. When Zeus arrives at his court, Lycaon either serves him a meal containing human flesh, specifically in some versions of the story the flesh of a Molossian hostage, or attempts to murder the god in his sleep to test whether he is truly divine. In response to this act of violence and sacrilege, Zeus transforms Lycaon into a wolf. Ovid describes the transformation in careful physical terms. Lycaon tries to speak but can only howl. His clothing becomes fur. His arms become forelegs. He becomes a wolf, but one that retains some traces of his former nature. The same gray color, the same fierce expression, the same eyes. He flees into the countryside and takes up the life of a wolf, attacking flocks and haunting the region. From this story, which was widely known throughout the ancient Greek and Roman world, comes the very word lycanthropy, from Lycaon's name and the Greek word anthropos, meaning human being. Lycanthropy, the condition of being or becoming a wolfman. But Ovid's account, whatever its literary merits, is itself drawing on a tradition that predates him by centuries. The Greek writer Pausanias, who wrote his description of Greece in the 2nd century CE, recorded a tradition associated with the region of Arcadia that was already ancient in his own time. According to Pausanias, there was a sanctuary of Zeus Lycaos, Zeus the wolf, on a mountain in Arcadia, and at this sanctuary rituals took place that were, even by the standards of the ancient Greeks themselves, considered extremely old and extremely dark. The details that Pausanias records, with obvious uncertainty and some discomfort, suggest that human sacrifice may have been involved, and that participants in certain rituals were believed to undergo temporary transformation into wolves. He notes that any person who ate the flesh of a sacrificed human at this site would become a wolf for 9 years, and that at the end of 9 years, if the person had not eaten human flesh again during that period, they would return to human form. This is a fully articulated werewolf belief system. It has a mechanism, the consumption of human flesh. It has a duration, 9 years. It has a condition for reversal, abstaining from human flesh during the transformation period. And it is localized to a specific place, a specific religious site, with a specific historical and archaeological footprint. The mountain in question, Mount Lycaon in Arcadia, has been the subject of ongoing archaeological excavation. Researchers working the site in recent decades have found evidence of ash deposits, burnt animal bones, and what appear to be ritual deposits, consistent with a site of long-term religious activity. Whether any of the darker details in ancient accounts reflect real ritual practices remains a matter of scholarly debate. But the physical site exists. The ancient accounts that describe it exist. And the belief that something transformative, something involving the crossing of the boundary between human and animal, took place there appears to be very old indeed. Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE, centuries before Ovid and without any evident connection to the Lycaon myth, recorded a tradition among the Scythians, a nomadic people who lived in the region north of the Black Sea, roughly corresponding to parts of modern Ukraine and Russia. The Scythians, Herodotus wrote, believed that a neighboring people called the Nuri underwent annual transformation into wolves. He is careful to note that he does not personally believe this, and that the Greeks who lived near Scythian territory also did not believe it, even though the Scythians themselves insisted it was true. What Herodotus gives us here is not evidence that anyone actually transformed into a wolf, but evidence that the belief in voluntary or periodic human-to-wolf transformation was already documented among specific cultural groups in the 5th century BCE, and that even ancient writers understood the difference between recording what people believed and endorsing that belief as fact. Moving further through the ancient world, the Roman writer Petronius, writing in the 1st century CE, gives us in his Satyricon what may be the oldest surviving prose narrative of an encounter with a werewolf, told in the voice of a character named Niceros, who recounts a journey he once made through the countryside at night. His companion on this journey, a soldier, stops at a crossroads, removes his clothing, urinates in a circle around it, and then transforms into a wolf before Niceros's eyes. The wolf runs off into the woods howling. Niceros eventually arrives at his destination, where he learns that a wolf has just been driven off from the farmyard, and that one of the farmhands wounded it with a spear. The following day, Niceros discovers that his companion the soldier has a wound in exactly the place where the wolf was stabbed. Petronius presents this as a ghost story told at a dinner party. It is framed as folk belief, as the kind of tale ordinary Romans told each other. But its details are precise and suggestive. The clothing left behind, the circle urinated on the ground, the wound that carries over from wolf form to human form. These same motifs, the discarded clothing, the persisting wound, will appear again and again in werewolf accounts across more than 15 subsequent centuries. Pliny the Elder, the Roman naturalist and writer who died during the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, addressed the question of lycanthropy directly in his Natural History, one of the most comprehensive encyclopedic works of the ancient world. Pliny was a careful and generally skeptical observer, and his treatment of lycanthropy is notable for his tone of measured doubt. He acknowledges that the belief exists, cites Greek sources that describe it, notes the tradition associated with the sanctuary of Zeus Lycaos in Arcadia, and then states plainly that he considers the idea of actual human-to-wolf physical transformation to be false. But he also notes that the belief is widespread and old, which itself, he suggests, is worth recording. Pliny's account is significant precisely because it demonstrates that even in the ancient world, the werewolf occupied an ambiguous space, widely believed by common people, recorded by educated writers, and disputed by those same writers even as they documented the belief's existence. From the ancient Mediterranean, the trail moves northward into the Germanic and Norse worlds, where the werewolf tradition takes on a different character and different cultural meanings. The Old Norse word for werewolf is ulfhein, meaning wolfskin, or alternatively vargolfr, meaning wolf-wolf, a doubled word that suggests something emphatic, something beyond ordinary wolfishness. But Norse saga literature also contains a more nuanced and philosophically distinct category, the berserker. The berserker, as described in multiple Norse sagas including the Ynglinga saga compiled by Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century CE, were warriors who fought in a state of extreme fury, described as going into battle like wolves or bears, biting their shields, killing without mercy, and feeling neither fire nor iron during the battle rage. The sagas describe these warriors as a word that carries connotations of madness, divine possession, and wild, uncontrollable energy. The berserker was not, in most saga accounts, physically transforming into a wolf. But the boundary between the metaphorical and the literal is not always clearly drawn in these texts. In some accounts, including portions of the Völsunga Saga, characters who wear wolf skins are explicitly described as undergoing actual transformation. They become wolves in body, not just in spirit, and they hunt and kill as wolves hunt and kill. The Völsunga Saga, a Norse saga that survives in a 13th century Icelandic manuscript but draws on much older mythological material, contains one of the most detailed and narratively developed werewolf sequences in early European literature. In it, the characters Sigmund and Sinfjotli discover wolf skins hanging in a house in the forest. They put the skins on and are transformed into wolves, unable to remove the skins for a period of days. During this time they hunt, kill, and behave entirely as wolves. The transformation is involuntary in the sense that they cannot reverse it until a set period has passed, and it is physical in the sense that the text describes them howling, running on four legs and communicating in wolf language. The skins are eventually removed, and both men return to human form. The saga presents this episode not as a horror story but as a significant event in the hero's development. The experience of being wolves, of moving through the world as predators, is part of what makes them the warriors they will become. This is a fundamentally different moral framework from what would later develop in Christian Europe, where werewolfism would be read almost exclusively as evidence of demonic corruption or divine punishment. In the Norse context, at least in this saga tradition, the ability to take on wolf nature is frightening and dangerous, but it is also powerful and, in certain contexts, even admirable. It is part of the heroic world, not outside it. The documentary trail of werewolf belief in the historical record, then, begins not in medieval dungeons or witch trial courts but in the sunlit texts of ancient Greece and Rome, in the clay tablets of Mesopotamia, in the Norse sagas preserved in Icelandic manuscripts, in the travel writings of Greek historians observing unfamiliar cultures with careful and sometimes skeptical eyes. The werewolf, in the historical record, is ancient. It is widespread. And it means very different things depending on when, where, and by whom the story is being told. One of the most striking things that emerges from a serious study of werewolf beliefs across cultures is how differently the idea is understood depending on where you are standing. What the Greek tradition understands as a divine punishment, the Norse tradition can understand as a heroic attribute. What medieval Christian Europe understands as a demonic transaction, indigenous traditions in other parts of the world understand as a form of spiritual power or shamanistic ability. The surface of the story, a human being who takes on wolf or large predator form, remains consistent. Almost everything beneath that surface changes. In the ancient Greek tradition, as we have already seen, lycanthropy is primarily understood as a punishment. The gods impose it. The human being who becomes a wolf has done something wrong, has committed an act of violence, sacrilege, or impiety that has separated them from the human community and from divine favor. The transformation is a form of justice, or at least of divine power asserting itself. Lycaon becomes a wolf because he has behaved like one, has shown contempt for the gods, has committed violence against a guest, has crossed a fundamental line. The transformation makes his inner nature visible in his outer form. This idea, that the werewolf transformation reveals something true about the person's inner character, that it is a kind of truth-telling imposed on the body, will become extremely important in later Christian interpretations of lycanthropy. But in the Greek context, it does not carry quite the same moral weight. The gods of the Greek pantheon are themselves capable of violence, cruelty, and transgression. Zeus, who punishes Lycaon, is also a god who has committed numerous acts that would strike most moral frameworks as deeply problematic. The punishment is real and terrible, but it does not carry the same absolute moral condemnation that later religious frameworks will attach to the werewolf figure. Moving from Greece and Rome into the Celtic world of early medieval Ireland and Britain, we find a tradition that is distinct from both the Greek punishment model and the Norse heroic model. The most detailed early Irish account of werewolf-like transformation comes from the work of the medieval writer Geraldus Cambrensis, Gerald of Wales, who wrote his Topographia Hibernica or Topography of Ireland, around 1188 CE. Gerald was a Welsh clergyman writing within a Christian framework, and his account must be read with that in mind. But he describes in careful detail a tradition associated with the region of Ossory in Ireland, in which the people of that region were said to be under a curse laid upon them by Saint Natalie's. According to Gerald's account, two people from Ossory, a man and a woman, were compelled by this curse to leave their human forms and wander as wolves for 7 years, at the end of which they would return to human form if they survived, and another pair from the same region would take their place. Gerald records a story in which a priest traveling through the Irish wilderness encounters a wolf who speaks to him in a human voice, identifies itself as one of the cursed people of Ossory, and asks the priest to administer the last rites to a dying wolf companion. The priest does so, reportedly after the wolf pulls back the wolf's skin covering the dying companion to reveal the human woman underneath. Gerald presents this story as something he has gathered from eyewitness accounts and local tradition, and he discusses at some length the theological question of whether such transformation is possible within a Christian framework, noting that St. Augustine himself had written on the subject. What is significant about the Ossory tradition as Gerald records it is that the werewolves in this account are explicitly not evil. They are cursed people, suffering against their will, retaining their human minds and their Christian faith even within their wolf bodies. The dying wolf woman receives the last rites. She is a Christian soul in an animal body, and she is entitled to Christian spiritual care. This is a quite different moral landscape from what will develop in the 16th and 17th centuries, when werewolves in European witch trial records will be understood almost universally as agents of the devil, as people who have chosen damnation. Across the Atlantic, in the indigenous cultures of North America, a concept that has sometimes been loosely compared to lycanthropy by Western observers appears in various forms, though scholars of Native American traditions are careful to note that direct comparison to the European werewolf is often misleading and reductive. The concept of the skinwalker, known in Navajo tradition as Yinald Lushii, which translates roughly as "with it he goes on all fours," describes a type of witch or sorcerer who has the ability to transform into, or take on the attributes of various animals, including wolves, coyotes, foxes, and birds. The skinwalker is unambiguously evil within Navajo moral understanding. It is a person who has chosen to use their power for harm, who has violated fundamental taboos including the taboo against killing a family member, and the ability to transform is understood as something that has been earned through deliberate corruption rather than imposed as a curse or inherited as a heroic attribute. It should be noted that serious anthropological research on Navajo skinwalker beliefs is complicated by the fact that many members of the Navajo Nation consider it inappropriate or harmful to discuss these beliefs with outsiders, and the best academic accounts, including those by researchers such as David Klausner and others who have worked within appropriate ethical frameworks, acknowledge significant limitations in what can be known from the outside. The comparison to the European werewolf is useful as a rough analytical category. The skinwalker is a human being who takes on animal form through supernatural means, but the cultural context, the moral framework, and the specific details differ substantially. In the Baltic and Slavic regions of Eastern Europe, werewolf traditions are particularly rich and, in some ways, particularly complex. The Baltic region, what is today Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, preserves some of the most intriguing documented werewolf beliefs in the historical record, in part because this region remained pagan longer than Western Europe, with Lithuania not formally Christianized until the late 14th century, and because the interaction between indigenous Baltic pagan beliefs and incoming Christianity produced some remarkable and well-documented hybrid belief systems. In Slavic folk tradition across what is today Poland, Russia, Ukraine, the Czech Republic, and neighboring countries, the werewolf, known by various names including Vukadlak in Serbian, Vrkolak in Bulgarian, and Vavkalaka in Ukrainian, occupies a position in the folk taxonomy that is distinct from the Western European tradition in several important ways. In much of Slavic tradition, a person could become a werewolf not only through a deal with the devil or a divine punishment but through a variety of other mechanisms. Being born at a certain time of year, particularly at the solstices or at Christmas, being the seventh consecutive son in a family, being cursed by a parent, being bitten by another werewolf, or dying in a state of excommunication from the church. Some Slavic traditions make the werewolf figure closely related to or even identical with the vampire figure, as both represent the dangerous dead or the demonically corrupted individual who becomes a predatory threat to the living community. In the Balkan tradition specifically, recorded by 19th and early 20th century ethnographers including Veselin Kachkanovic and others who worked in the field collecting oral tradition, the werewolf is often understood less as a live person who transforms and more as a post-mortem state. The body of a person who led a sinful life and was refused proper burial might become a werewolf, which in these traditions sometimes overlaps with vampire-like behaviors, returning from the grave, attacking animals and people, drinking blood. This conflation of werewolf and vampire is itself a fascinating artifact of how these categories of supernatural danger are organized differently in different cultural frameworks. In the Nordic countries, the werewolf traditions preserved in saga literature and later Scandinavian folklore take a form that is, in some ways, closer to the shamanic traditions of Siberia and Central Asia than to the punishment and damnation model of Christian Europe. The concept of the hammer, preserved in Old Norse texts, refers to a kind of shape, a second shape, a spiritual body, that a skilled practitioner could separate from the physical body and send out in animal form. The seer practitioners described in Norse mythology and in some saga texts were believed to have the ability to do this. When the physical body lay in a trance-like state, the hammer, which might take the form of a wolf, a bear, a bird, or other animals, traveled through the world and could interact with the physical world in various ways. This is a shamanic belief structure with very close parallels to documented shamanic practices in Siberia, Mongolia, and among the Sami people of northern Scandinavia, and it suggests that at least some of what later crystallized into werewolf mythology in Europe may have roots in much older shamanic traditions of soul travel and animal transformation. In sub-Saharan Africa, the counterpart to the werewolf in many traditions is not a wolf, wolves being absent from most of the continent, but rather a were-leopard or were-hyena or were-lion, depending on the region and the particular predator that represents the greatest danger and the greatest power in the local ecosystem. Were-animal beliefs in Africa have been documented by ethnographers including E. Evans Pritchard in his work on the Azanda people of Central Africa, and by numerous other researchers working in various regional contexts. The structural similarities to European werewolf beliefs are notable. The idea of a person who takes on predator form, typically through a pact, an inheritance, or a spiritual endowment, the belief that such a person is dangerous to the community, the association of the transformation with violence and death, and the existence of specific methods for identifying, countering, and potentially curing such individuals. In Japan, the werewolf as such does not exist as a native concept, but the tanuki, the shape-shifting raccoon dog, and the kitsune, the shape-shifting fox, represent beings that move between human and animal form, and the concept of the werewolf, when introduced to Japanese audiences through Western contact, has been adapted and transformed in ways that reflect distinctly Japanese cultural frameworks. This is a later and more modern phenomenon and belongs more properly to the section on cultural legacy. But it is worth noting as evidence of how flexibly the core idea adapts to different cultural environments. What all of these traditions share, beneath their very considerable differences, is a cluster of related concerns. The concern about the boundary between human and animal, about what makes a person human, and what happens when that humanity is lost or set aside. The concern about predation, about the person within the community who is secretly dangerous, who appears human but has the capacity and perhaps the desire to kill. The concern about transformation, about the instability of identity, about the body as something that can be changed, corrupted, or remade. And the concern about power, about the fact that the ability to cross the boundary between human and animal is not merely frightening but in many traditions is also enviable, because the wolf or the leopard or the bear, or whatever animal stands in for apex predator in a given cultural context, represents a kind of freedom and power that the social, constrained, morally burdened human being cannot access. These are not trivial concerns. They are concerns about the fundamental nature of human identity, human society, and human violence. And perhaps that is why the werewolf, in one form or another, keeps appearing in the historical record, culture after culture, century after century. The werewolf of the documented historical record, as it appears in trial transcripts, in folklore accounts recorded by ethnographers, in theological texts, in medical literature, and in the literary works that drew on popular belief, is not a uniform creature. Its appearance, its abilities, its vulnerabilities, and the mechanisms by which it transforms vary considerably across traditions and across time. But within specific cultural and historical contexts, those descriptions are often surprisingly precise and internally consistent, and they tell us a great deal about what people actually believed. Beginning with the question of appearance during transformation, the historical accounts divide into two broad categories: those in which the werewolf is described as an actual wolf, indistinguishable from an ordinary wolf except perhaps by its unusual size or behavior, and those in which the werewolf is described as something intermediate, a creature that is neither fully human nor fully wolf, a hybrid form. The fully wolf model is the dominant one in medieval and early modern European trial records. When accused werewolves in 16th and 17th century French, German, and Baltic trial proceedings described their transformed state, they typically described themselves as wolves, four-legged, furred, toothed. Peter Stumpp, the German farmer tried and executed in 1589, whose case we will examine in detail in the following section, described in his confession, a confession given under circumstances of considerable legal pressure, that he transformed into the likeness of a greedy devouring wolf, strong and mighty, with eyes great and large, which in the night sparkled like unto brands of fire, a mouth great and wide, with most sharp and cruel teeth, a huge body and mighty paws. This is a fully animal form, not a hybrid. But it also has those glowing eyes, that enormous body, those characteristics that mark it out from any ordinary wolf. The hybrid form, upright, partially human, partially wolf, appears more commonly in folk belief accounts and in the later literary and artistic tradition than it does in the trial records themselves. When ordinary people in rural communities described encounters with creatures they identified as werewolves, as recorded by ethnographers in the 19th and early 20th centuries in regions including Bavaria, the Balkans, and the Baltic states, they sometimes described things that walked upright, that had wolfish heads on roughly human bodies, or that had human faces with animal characteristics. This hybrid form is also more consistent with the ancient Greek literary descriptions of Lycaon's transformation in Ovid. The partially retained human features, the same eyes, the same expression, in a new and terrible body. The question of size is consistent across a great many traditions. The werewolf is almost always described as larger than an ordinary wolf. Peter Stumpp's confession describes a mighty body. Germanic folklore accounts recorded in the 19th century by scholars including Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm in their broader collection of German folk traditions describe werewolves as conspicuously large. Baltic traditions similarly emphasize unusual size as one of the markers by which a wolf-form werewolf might be distinguished from an ordinary animal. This emphasis on unusual size is consistent with what psychologists and anthropologists have noted about how fear affects perception and memory. Things that are dangerous tend to be remembered as larger than they were, but it is also a consistent and repeated feature of the documented tradition. The eyes receive special attention in many accounts. Glowing eyes, red eyes, eyes that shine in darkness, eyes that retain the intelligence and sometimes the anguish of the human being within. This feature appears in classical descriptions, in medieval trial accounts, and in folk belief across multiple traditions. The survival of human eyes in an animal body is in some ways the most philosophically interesting characteristic attributed to the werewolf, because it is the detail that raises the most troubling questions. If the eyes are human, if the person within is still there, still watching, still aware, Then what is the moral status of what the werewolf does? Is it capable of guilt? Can it be held responsible? These are questions that, as we will see, the trial judges of early modern Europe struggled with directly. The mechanism of transformation is one of the most culturally variable aspects of werewolf belief. In classical Greek tradition, transformation is imposed by divine decree. It is something done to the person, not something the person does. In Norse tradition, transformation is achieved through the use of a wolf's skin. Putting on the skin of an animal creates the change. In the trial records of early modern Europe, the most common mechanism described in confessions is a salve or ointment applied to the body, or a belt or girdle made of wolf skin given by the devil, or occasionally a direct verbal pact with the devil that confers the power of transformation at will. In Baltic tradition, and particularly in the case of Thiess of Kaltenbrun in 1692, one of the most extraordinary werewolf trial records in existence, the transformation is voluntary and the transformed state is understood as spiritually protective rather than destructive. In Slavic folk tradition, mechanisms include the use of specific plants, the removal of clothing and rolling in the earth at a crossroads, the wearing of a specific type of belt, or simply being born under particular conditions. The moon, that symbol so absolutely central to the modern popular understanding of the werewolf that it has become almost impossible to discuss the subject without it, is remarkably quite uncommon in the pre-modern documented historical record. The full moon as a trigger for werewolf transformation does not appear in the ancient Greek or Roman accounts in any significant way. It does not appear in the Norse saga material. It is not a feature of the early modern trial confessions. It is not centrally featured in the medieval theological debates about lycanthropy. The strong association between werewolves and the full moon appears to have developed primarily through literary and theatrical tradition in the 19th century, and was then so thoroughly embedded in popular culture through the 20th century film industry that it now feels like a permanent and ancient part of the mythology. It is not. Or rather, while moon-related beliefs do appear in some specific folk traditions, some Baltic and Slavic accounts mention the full moon, and some folk remedies for lycanthropy involve lunar timing, the moon is not the consistent, defining characteristic of werewolf transformation that popular culture has made it. What is a much more consistent characteristic across documented traditions is the night. Not a specific phase of the moon but the darkness itself. Werewolves in the historical record hunt at night. They are encountered at night. They transform at night or in isolated, liminal spaces, crossroads, forest edges, places between settlement and wilderness. This is consistent with what anthropologists note about the symbolic geography of monster beliefs in general. Monsters occupy the margins, the spaces between the organized, lit human world and the uncontrolled natural world beyond. The powers attributed to werewolves in the historical record are significant and relatively consistent within specific cultural contexts, even if they vary across traditions. Physical strength greater than that of ordinary wolves or ordinary humans is almost universal. Speed is frequently mentioned. The ability to take human life quickly and with apparent ease is central to nearly all werewolf accounts in the trial record. The werewolves described in 16th and 17th century European court proceedings are accused of killing adults, children, and livestock with terrifying efficiency. In some specific traditions, werewolves are attributed additional powers beyond simple physical predation. The ability to render themselves invisible or to move without being heard or tracked appears in certain Baltic and Slavic accounts. The ability to communicate with actual wolves, or to command them, appears in some folk belief traditions. The ability to travel at supernatural speed, to cover distances in a transformed state that would be impossible for an ordinary animal, is mentioned in some accounts. In the Norse shamanic tradition, as discussed, the transformed state also conveys a kind of spiritual power, the ability to operate in the spirit world and to affect events at a distance. Across traditions, the werewolf's power is closely tied to its transgression. It is powerful precisely because it has crossed a line, has left the bounded, rule-governed human world and entered a space where human constraints do not apply. The same crossing that makes it dangerous makes it powerful. The wolf can go where humans cannot. The wolf does not observe the social rules that govern human behavior. The wolf kills without guilt, without deliberation, without the hesitation that moral awareness imposes on human action. In many ways, the werewolf in the historical record is not simply a frightening creature. It is also, in some disturbing sense, a free one. The weaknesses of the werewolf in the historical record are equally revealing of the cultural context from which they emerge. In the ancient Greek tradition, the werewolf's primary vulnerability is the power of the gods who cursed it. The transformation can be reversed by divine action or, as in the Arcadian tradition recorded by Pausanias, by the passage of time and the individual's own behavior. There is no specific weapon or substance that defeats it. In early modern Christian Europe, the primary counterforce to werewolf power is, unsurprisingly, the authority of the Church and the power of Christian faith. In the accounts of werewolf trials and in the theological texts that attempted to explain and categorize the phenomenon, werewolves were understood as being in league with or under the control of the devil, and the resources available against demonic power, prayer, holy water, the sacraments, exorcism, and ultimately the secular authority of the law, were the appropriate responses. The werewolf, in this framework, is defeated not by a silver bullet but by the combined force of Christian civilization asserting itself against diabolical transgression. Silver as a specific weakness of the werewolf is, like the full moon, a feature whose origins in the documented historical record are surprisingly recent and surprisingly narrow. The folk tradition does preserve the idea that silver has power against supernatural evil in a general sense, and silver bullets appear in German folk tradition as effective against various supernatural threats, including werewolves in accounts from the 18th and 19th centuries. The story of the Beast of Gévaudan in France in the 1760s, a large predatory animal that killed dozens of people in the Auvergne region and was surrounded by considerable supernatural speculation, includes later accounts that attribute the animal's eventual death to a silver bullet, though contemporaneous records do not support this. The silver bullet as the specific and singular werewolf weakness became fully solidified in the 20th century popular imagination through film, fiction, and popular culture, rather than through any single ancient or medieval tradition. The wound that persists across transformation, the injury received in wolf form that appears on the human body after return to human form, is, by contrast, one of the oldest and most consistently documented features of werewolf belief across traditions. It appears in Petronius in the 1st century CE. It appears in Giraldus Cambrensis in the 12th century. It appears in medieval Breton and French fabliaux and folk tales. It appears in German trial records. It appears in Baltic folk belief. Across many centuries and many different cultural contexts, the idea that the wolf body and the human body share injuries, that wounding the wolf means wounding the person, is one of the most persistent and widely distributed characteristics in the entire historical record of werewolf belief. This shared wound serves a very specific narrative purpose in many accounts. It is the mechanism by which the werewolf is unmasked. The wolf is wounded during an attack or an encounter. The next day the suspected person, a neighbor, a spouse, a traveler, is found to be injured in the corresponding location. The wound is the proof. The wound bridges the two identities and makes visible what was hidden. In legal and quasi-legal contexts, as recorded in several trial accounts, the discovery of such a wound was considered significant evidence of guilt. The question of consciousness during transformation, whether the werewolf retains human awareness or loses itself entirely to animal instinct, is treated differently in different traditions and is, in some ways, the most philosophically significant question in the entire body of werewolf belief. In many of the early modern European trial confessions, the accused describes having full awareness of what they were doing in wolf form. They name their victims, they describe their actions with apparent recall, they express remorse or occasionally, more disturbingly, satisfaction. Peter Stumpp's confession describes deliberate, targeted violence carried out with full intention. In contrast, other accused individuals in various trial contexts describe the loss of consciousness during the transformation. They found themselves in wolf form without knowing how they got there, or returned to human form with no memory of what had occurred in between. This distinction matters because it has theological and legal implications. If the person is fully conscious and in control during the transformation, they are morally and legally responsible for what they do. If they are unconscious, controlled by an outside force, by the devil, by a curse they did not choose, their culpability is less clear. The theological debates of the 16th and 17th centuries grappled with this directly, and different inquisitors and theologians came to different conclusions. Heinrich Kramer, the Dominican inquisitor whose Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, would become one of the most influential witch-hunting manuals in history, was firmly in the camp that understood all lycanthropic transformation as a form of diabolical deception. The person was not physically transformed but was deceived into believing they had been, or deceived others into believing it, through the agency of the devil. This was actually a position that preserved the theological orthodoxy of the Church, which held that only God could truly alter the nature of created things, and that the devil's power, while real and dangerous, was ultimately limited. Other theologians and legal authorities disagreed, and some trial records reflect actual physical transformation as a genuine belief held by both the accused and the court. The tension between these positions, actual physical transformation versus diabolical illusion, runs through the entire early modern period of werewolf prosecution and was never fully resolved to the satisfaction of all parties. What emerges from a careful reading of the historical record on werewolf appearance, characteristics, powers and weaknesses is something considerably more complex and considerably more culturally specific than the uniform creature of popular imagination. The historical werewolf is shaped by its cultural context. It reflects the fears, the moral frameworks, the theological convictions, and the social anxieties of the people who believed in it. Its appearance answers the question, what does transgression look like? Its powers answer the question, what would it mean to be free of human constraint? Its weaknesses answer the question, what forces do we have that can protect us from what we fear most? And its consciousness, that troubling human awareness behind animal eyes, answers the question that may be the most unsettling of all. What if the monster is not a stranger? What if the monster is someone we know? What if the monster is, in some sense, ourselves? These are the questions that the historical record of werewolf belief has been asking, in different languages and different cultural idioms, for more than 4,000 years. And in the documented cases that follow, in the trial rooms of early modern Europe, in the confessions of real people who stood before real judges and described in careful detail what they believed they had done, those questions will receive their most disturbing and most historically concrete answers. The historical record of werewolf belief is not made up only of myths and legends passed down through generations of oral tradition. It is also made up of documents, real documents, court records written by real clerks, signed by real judges, describing real trials in which real people stood accused of crimes they believed, or claimed to believe, or were tortured into claiming they believed, involved the transformation of a human body into that of a wolf. These documents sit in archives across Europe. They have been studied by historians, folklorists, anthropologists, and legal scholars. And what they reveal is something that no fictional werewolf story has ever quite managed to capture. The full, uncomfortable weight of history pressing down on individual human beings caught in a web of belief, fear, social pressure, and institutional power. To understand these cases properly, it is necessary to understand the world in which they took place. 16th and 17th century Europe was a world in which the existence of the devil was not a metaphor. It was a theological and legal fact, recognized by Catholic and Protestant authorities alike, written into the legal codes of nations, and accepted as real by virtually every educated person on the continent. The devil was understood to be active in the world, recruiting human beings into his service, granting them powers in exchange for their souls, and working through them to corrupt Christian society. Within this framework, the werewolf was not a creature of mythology. It was a category of criminal. A person who had made a pact with the devil and received in exchange for that pact, the power to transform and to kill. It is within this framework, this specific historically documented, theologically driven framework, that the great werewolf trials of early modern Europe must be understood. Of all the documented werewolf cases in the historical record, the trial of Peter Stumpp in the German town of Bedburg, near Cologne in 1589, is among the most extensively recorded and the most frequently cited by historians of the witch trial period. The primary surviving account of the case comes from a pamphlet printed in both German and English in 1590, which describes the accusations, the trial, and the execution in considerable detail. The pamphlet, like all such accounts, must be read critically. It was a piece of popular literature produced after the fact, and it almost certainly reflects and amplifies the most dramatic elements of the case. But it draws on the official proceedings, and the broad outlines of what it describes are consistent with what historians know of the legal practices and trial procedures of the period. Peter Stumpp, his name is also rendered as Stump, Stumpf, or Abel Griswold in various sources, reflecting inconsistencies in early modern German record-keeping, was a farmer living in the region around Bedburg in the Lower Rhineland. He was accused of a series of extraordinarily violent crimes: the murder of multiple adults and children, the consumption of human flesh, sexual crimes, and a 25-year career of predatory violence carried out, as the accusations described it, in the form of a wolf. According to the pamphlet account, Stumpp confessed that from the age of 12 he had practiced sorcery, and that the devil had given him a magic girdle, a belt, which when he put it on transformed him into the likeness of a greedy devouring wolf. When he removed the girdle, he returned to his human form. He described going out at night in wolf form to attack travelers, children, and livestock. He described specific murders in detail, including the killing of pregnant women and the consumption of their unborn children, the murder of 2 men and a woman whose hearts he allegedly consumed, and the killing of 13 children by name in the surrounding area. He also confessed to sexual crimes of an extremely serious nature. The confession was given under torture. This is an essential fact about this document and about virtually all trial confessions from this period. The judicial procedures of early modern European courts, both secular and ecclesiastical, routinely employed torture as a means of obtaining confession, and confession was considered the most important form of evidence in cases of this kind. A confession given under torture does not reliably tell us what the person actually did or believed. It tells us what the person said when subjected to extreme physical pain, often guided by leading questions from interrogators who already had a specific narrative they were seeking to confirm. What the Stumpp case does tell us reliably is several things. That the legal and theological framework of the period provided a complete and coherent account of how a werewolf operated, the devil, the girdle, the transformation, the predation, the pact, and that this framework was well enough established that an accused person could be led through its details step by step. It tells us that the community of Bedburg had suffered real losses. There were real dead people, real missing children, real violence, and that the attribution of those losses to a werewolf provided an explanation and, in the execution of Stumpp, a resolution. It tells us that the punishment for the crime of lycanthropy as understood in this period was extreme. Stumpp was broken on the wheel, had flesh torn from his body with red-hot pincers, had his limbs broken, was beheaded and was finally burned. His daughter and a woman described as his mistress were also executed. The body parts were displayed publicly as a warning. The Stumpp case was widely reported across Germany and beyond. The English pamphlet of 1590 describing the case was read throughout England and contributed to a broader popular consciousness about werewolves as a real and present danger. It is one of the clearest examples of how the legal machinery of early modern Europe could transform a local violent crime, or a series of crimes whose true nature and perpetrator may have been quite different from what the record claims, into a documented werewolf case. France in the 16th century produced a remarkable cluster of werewolf cases that together represent one of the most concentrated periods of werewolf prosecution in European legal history. The French trials are particularly valuable to historians because they involved not only the secular legal system but also serious medical and theological engagement with the question of whether lycanthropic transformation was real, and they produce some of the most thoughtful documentary engagement with the phenomenon anywhere in the historical record. The case of Gilles Garnier, tried and executed in the Franche-Comté region of eastern France in 1573, is among the most carefully documented. Garnier was a hermit living in the forests near the town of Dole. He was accused of attacking and killing several children in the area, and of consuming their flesh. The accusations were framed in terms of lycanthropy. Garnier was said to have committed these acts in wolf form. According to the trial record, which survives and has been studied by historians including Emma de Haas and others working in the field of early modern legal history, Garnier confessed under interrogation to having made a pact with a spirit or demon who provided him with an ointment that allowed him to transform into a wolf. He then described specific attacks on named children in specific locations over a period of months. The legal document produced by the Dole Parliament in response to these accusations is remarkable for its specificity. It names the victims, gives the dates and approximate locations of the attacks, and describes the injuries to the bodies in terms that suggest actual post-mortem examination. Whether Garnier committed the murders attributed to him, and historians of crime as well as historians of the witch trial period note that actual predatory violence against children was certainly not impossible in rural 16th century France. What specific mental state he was in when he committed them, and how much of the lycanthropic framing was his own belief versus a narrative imposed by the interrogators, cannot be determined from the surviving record. What the record does show is that the court found the lycanthropic framework sufficient explanation and sufficient legal basis for execution. Garnier was burned alive. Also in France, slightly later, the case of Jacques Roulet, tried in Angers in 1598, takes a somewhat different turn that makes it particularly significant. Roulet was found near the body of a mutilated child in what witnesses described as a partly transformed state, crouching with blood on his hands and face, in what may have been a state of psychotic episode or extreme dissociation. He was tried, confessed to being a werewolf, and was initially condemned to death. But the decision was appealed to the Paris Parliament, which reviewed the case and came to a different conclusion. The Paris Parliament overturned the death sentence and instead committed Roulet to a house of corrections for 2 years, on the grounds that he was mad rather than criminal, that his lycanthropic beliefs and behaviors were the product of mental illness rather than genuine diabolical pact. The Roulet case is therefore one of the earliest documented instances in the legal record of a court explicitly substituting a psychiatric explanation. In the terminology available at the time, the explanation of madness, for a supernatural one. It sits at a remarkable historical pivot point. Another significant French case is that of Jean Granier, tried in Bordeaux in 1603. Granier was a young boy, estimated to be approximately 13 years old, who confessed to having made a pact with the devil and to having attacked and consumed several children in wolf form. The judge in this case, president of the Bordeaux Parliament Pierre de Lancourt, who was himself one of the most active witch hunters in France at the time and the author of several books on witchcraft and demonic pacts, nonetheless concluded that Granier was mentally incapable rather than genuinely culpable. Granier was committed to a Franciscan monastery, where he lived for the rest of his life. He was reportedly observed there periodically running on all fours, eating raw offal, and exhibiting other behaviors that his keepers described as wolf-like. He died in the monastery around 1611. The Granier case, like the Roulet case, represents an important moment in which French legal authorities began to distinguish between the criminal werewolf, the adult who makes a conscious pact with the devil, and the mentally disturbed person whose wolf beliefs are symptoms of illness rather than evidence of diabolical commerce. The German witch trials of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the most intensive period of witch persecution in European history by sheer numbers, produced numerous cases that incorporated lycanthropic elements. The Stumpp case discussed above is the most famous, but it is far from the only one. Werewolf accusations appeared in trial records from across the German-speaking territories, from Bavaria, from the Rhineland, from Westphalia, from Saxony. In many of these cases, the lycanthropic element was one accusation among many in a broader witchcraft indictment. A person accused of attending Sabbaths, of consorting with the devil, might also be accused of having transformed into a wolf to attack cattle or people. The German trials are notable for the degree to which they engaged both secular and ecclesiastical legal systems simultaneously, and for the role that legal treatises and witch-hunting manuals played in shaping the questions interrogators asked and therefore the answers they received. Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum, already mentioned, went through multiple editions and was enormously influential in defining both the theological understanding of witchcraft and the practical procedures of witch prosecution. On the specific question of werewolf transformation, Kramer's position, that physical transformation was impossible and that lycanthropy was a form of diabolical illusion, was not universally followed by secular courts, which sometimes operated under different assumptions and different legal frameworks. This tension between ecclesiastical and secular understandings of what exactly lycanthropy was produced, in the German trial record, a considerable range of accounts and conclusions. If the Stumpp case represents the werewolf trial at its most brutal and its most thoroughly embedded in the diabolical framework, then the case of Thiess of Kaltenbrun, tried in the Baltic region of Livonia in 1692, represents something almost completely different. A werewolf who defied every category his judges attempted to place him in. Thiess was an elderly Latvian peasant, estimated to be around 80 years old at the time of his trial, who had been brought before a court in Jurgensburg on an initial charge unrelated to lycanthropy. During the proceedings, however, Thiess voluntarily and without apparent coercion announced that he was a werewolf. Not with shame, not as a confession of wrongdoing, but as a simple statement of fact and, remarkably, as something approaching a statement of pride. The trial record, which survives and has been studied extensively by historians including Carlo Ginzburg, who devoted significant attention to it in his 1966 book The Night Battles and discussed related material in subsequent work, is one of the most extraordinary documents in the entire history of werewolf belief. In it, Thiess explains to his baffled judges that werewolves are the hounds of God, that they travel to hell 3 times a year, at specific dates corresponding roughly to the old pagan agricultural festivals of the Baltic calendar, and fight the witches and sorcerers there who have stolen the grain, the livestock fertility, and the agricultural abundance of the region. If the werewolves win these battles, the harvest is good. If the witches win, the harvest fails. Thiess identifies himself and his fellow werewolves as protectors of the community, not threats to it. He says he has the broken nose he received in one of these infernal battles as evidence of the fighting. He is not concerned that his judges think badly of him. He seems, from the record, to consider their confusion somewhat beneath him. Thiess's judges were genuinely uncertain what to do with him. Their theological framework told them that any commerce with the supernatural, any transformation, any travel to hell was necessarily diabolical, necessarily sinful, necessarily criminal. But Thiess denied the devil entirely. He insisted that he and the other werewolves were fighting the devil's agents, not serving the devil. He expressed Christian piety in conventional terms. He showed no signs of guilt or concealment. The trial record reflects the court's visible struggle to reconcile Thiess's account with the existing theological categories. Eventually, Thiess was convicted not of lycanthropy but of superstition and false belief, and sentenced to 10 lashes and banishment. It was a remarkably mild punishment for what the court acknowledged was an extraordinary claim. The record does not reveal what Thiess actually experienced, whether he genuinely believed what he described, whether it reflected some older Baltic pagan tradition of shamanic spirit fighting that had survived into the late 17th century and been partially overlaid with Christian imagery, or whether there were other explanations. What it does reveal is a worldview so fundamentally different from that of the Christian legal authorities who tried him that the two sides could barely communicate, and yet Thiess survived the encounter with his freedom and his dignity largely intact. Carlo Ginzburg's analysis of the Thiess case, connecting it with the Italian Benandanti fertility cult members who also described fighting witches in spirit form at night, suggests that what Thiess described may represent the survival into the early modern period of a much older shamanic or agrarian religious tradition, one rooted in pre-Christian beliefs about the spirit world, agricultural fertility, and the role of specialized individuals in mediating between the human community and supernatural forces. Whether or not Ginzburg's specific arguments are accepted in all their details, and they have generated considerable academic discussion and some revision, the Thiess case stands as irreplaceable evidence that werewolf belief in the historical record was not uniform, not exclusively diabolical, and not always a product of persecution and fear. Sometimes the werewolf spoke for itself. The Beast of Gévaudan is a case that sits at the intersection of historical fact and werewolf mythology in a way that makes it genuinely difficult to categorize. It is not a trial case. No one was convicted of lycanthropy. But the events surrounding it, thoroughly documented in contemporary reports, local records, royal correspondence, and newspaper accounts from the period, generated intense supernatural speculation across France and contributed significantly to the continuation of werewolf belief into the Enlightenment period, when rationalism might have been expected to have largely displaced such concerns. Between approximately June 1764 and June 1767, a large predatory animal, or possibly more than one animal, killed an extraordinary number of people in the Gévaudan region of the Auvergne in south-central France. Contemporary and near-contemporary accounts vary in their tallies, but estimates of the death toll range from approximately 60 to more than 100 people killed, with many more injured. The victims were predominantly women, children, and teenagers who were working or traveling alone in isolated terrain. The attacks were savage and consistent. The animal targeted the throat and head, killed quickly and often removed and consumed portions of the body. The scale of the predation, its duration, and its apparent targeting of human beings rather than livestock drew immediate royal attention. Louis XV sent professional hunters and ultimately a company of dragoons to deal with the creature. The animal was described by survivors and witnesses in ways that consistently suggested something larger than an ordinary wolf. Descriptions mention unusual size, an unusual gait, a reddish color, and an apparent lack of fear of people that ordinary wolves do not typically display. Various animals were killed during the 3 years of attacks and presented as the beast, but the killings continued after each such announcement until the attacks apparently stopped in the summer of 1767, following the killing of a large wolf by a local hunter named Jean Chastel. The supernatural interpretation of the Beast of Gévaudan, the suggestion that it was not a natural animal but something else, a werewolf, a devil's creature, an agent of divine punishment, circulated widely in popular culture during the attacks and for long afterward. The peasant communities of the region held existing beliefs about shape-shifting and supernatural predators that were activated by the real and terrible events taking place around them. The scholarly literature on the Beast of Gévaudan is extensive, including analyses by historians J.M. Smith and others who have examined the documented record in detail, and most conclude that the animal responsible was most probably a large wolf or wolf hybrid of unusual size and individual behavioral aberrance. But the point for the history of werewolf belief is not what the animal was. It is what the people of Gévaudan and of France more broadly understood it to be, or feared it might be, and how those fears interacted with existing supernatural belief structures that were still very much alive in rural France even in the Age of Enlightenment. To understand why werewolf trials happened in the numbers and with the intensity they did in 16th and 17th century Europe, it is essential to understand the theological framework within which they operated. The werewolf of the witch trial era was not primarily a creature of folklore, in the sense of a story told around a fire for entertainment or to explain unusual animal behavior. It was a theological category, a legal category, a category defined by its relationship to the devil and by what that relationship meant for the soul of the accused and for the safety of the Christian community. The foundational question in Christian theology regarding lycanthropy was a simple one, but it had enormous consequences. Could a human being actually and physically transform into a wolf? And the answer that mainstream Christian theology arrived at, through a process of centuries of argument, was technically no, but in a way that actually made the accused guilt more serious, not less. The argument began with St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the most influential theologians in the history of the Western Church, who addressed the question of human-to-animal transformation in his City of God, written in the early 5th century CE. Augustine acknowledged the widespread popular belief in lycanthropy and in the related stories about the sorceresses of Arcadia who supposedly transformed travelers into pack animals. But he argued that what was actually happening in such cases was not genuine physical transformation, which only God had the power to perform, since only God had created the nature of things and could alter that nature, but rather a kind of illusionary manipulation of the senses. The devil in Augustine's framework could deceive. He could create in the minds of other people the appearance of transformation. He could perhaps even create a kind of phantasm, a false image of the person in wolf form. But he could not actually change what a human being was at the level of their God-created nature. This Augustinian position was enormously influential. It was restated and developed by Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century and formed the basis for the official theological position of the medieval church. And here is where the theological argument becomes legally and morally lethal for the accused. If the physical transformation is an illusion created by the devil, the person who appears to have become a wolf must have given the devil permission to use them in this way. The illusion requires a pact. The pact requires the person's consent. And consent to a pact with the devil is not merely a crime, it is a fundamental corruption of the soul, a deliberate rejection of God and the Christian community, a form of spiritual treason. Heinrich Kramer's Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486 and influential throughout the following 2 centuries, incorporated and extended this theological framework. On the specific question of werewolves, Kramer was clear. The person had not truly become a wolf. But through the agency of the devil, the person could kill as a wolf killed, and the crimes committed were real even if the transformation was illusory. The accused was responsible for those crimes, guilty of the pact that made them possible, and liable to the full severity of the law. Kramer's manual goes into considerable detail about the mechanisms of diabolical power, how the devil creates illusions, how he can cloud the senses of both the transformed person and those who observe them, how he provides the strength and capability to commit the acts attributed to werewolves while maintaining the theological principle that physical transformation is impossible for any power short of God. Not all theologians and jurists of the period accepted this position, however. Some secular authorities, operating under legal frameworks that were less tightly tied to Augustinian theology, treated werewolf transformation as a genuine physical fact. The divergence between those who understood lycanthropy as diabolical illusion and those who understood it as genuine physical transformation produced real differences in how cases were tried and how accused individuals were treated. The influential French magistrate and political theorist Jean Bodin, writing in his De Menomini de Sorciers in 1580, took a position at odds with the strict Augustinian line. Bodin argued that the devil's power was sufficient to produce real physical changes in the bodies of those who had made pacts with him. Bodin was not a credulous man by the standards of his time. He was a serious legal and political thinker whose 6 books of the Republic remains an important document in the history of political theory, and his willingness to assert the reality of physical lycanthropic transformation reflects how deeply the supernatural framework was embedded in even the most sophisticated intellectual culture of 16th century Europe. The relationship between werewolf belief and the broader witch hunt is not incidental. In the great witch trial panics of the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the periods of mass trials in Germany, France, Scotland, and elsewhere that executed tens of thousands of people for the crime of witchcraft, the werewolf functioned as one element in a larger and highly systematized ideology of diabolical conspiracy. The same conceptual apparatus that produced the witch trial, the pact with the devil, the Sabbath, the rejection of Christian baptism, the use of supernatural power to harm the community, also produced the werewolf trial. In many cases they were the same trial, with lycanthropy as one accusation among many in a broader witchcraft indictment. The gendering of witch trial accusations is well documented by historians. The majority of those accused of witchcraft in most regions and periods were women. But the werewolf cases interestingly skew differently. The majority of those accused specifically of lycanthropy in the trial record are male. This pattern has been noted by historians including Rolf Schult, whose detailed study of German werewolf trials notes that of the accused in cases where lycanthropy was a primary charge, men outnumbered women considerably. This may reflect the symbolic association of the werewolf with a particular kind of masculine predatory violence. The wolf as hunter, as physical threat, as creature of the wilderness, as opposed to the more typically feminine associations of witchcraft with poison, with the corruption of domestic spaces, with maleficent use of knowledge of herbs and medicines. The witch hunt era also saw the publication of numerous demonological texts, theological and legal treatises on the nature of witchcraft, demonic power and supernatural crime, that devoted significant attention to lycanthropy. Beyond Kramer and Bodin, these included the work of the Swiss physician and theologian Ludwig Lavater, whose De Spectris of 1570 discussed apparitions and transformations, the work of the Scottish King James VI, later James I of England, whose Demonology of 1597 addressed witchcraft and included discussion of demonic transformation, and the work of Pierre de Lancaire in France, whose Tableau de l'Inconstance de Mauvais Anges et Demons of 1612 drew on his experience as a judge in the Basque witch trials and included detailed accounts of werewolf belief in the region. These texts were read by judges, by clergy, by educated laypeople, and they created and maintained the intellectual and legal framework within which werewolf accusations were made, processed, and punished. The decline of the werewolf trial in the late 17th century is closely connected with the broader decline of the witch trial. As skepticism about the reliability of torture-induced confessions grew, as Enlightenment philosophy began to challenge the cosmological assumptions that had supported witch prosecution, and as secular legal systems gradually disentangled themselves from theological frameworks, the category of the werewolf as a legal offense became increasingly difficult to sustain. The Thiess case of 1692, with its oddly gentle outcome, already shows a court that is uncertain how to handle a lycanthropic claim. By the early 18th century, formal prosecution of people for the crime of being werewolves had effectively ended in Western and Central Europe, though the belief itself persisted in folk tradition long afterward, and in some rural communities continues to be reported by ethnographers into the 20th century. The history of attempts to explain werewolf belief in terms other than the supernatural is itself a long one. Even in the ancient world, as we have seen, writers like Pliny the Elder and Herodotus maintained a certain critical distance from the claims they recorded. But it was not until the modern period, broadly defined as beginning with the Enlightenment of the 18th century and extending through the development of modern psychiatry and medicine in the 19th and 20th centuries, that systematic, non-supernatural explanations were developed with sufficient rigor and clinical documentation to constitute a genuine alternative intellectual framework. Those explanations fall into two broad categories. The first is medical, the argument that certain physical diseases or physiological conditions could produce in an affected person symptoms that would, in a pre-modern cultural context, be interpreted as lycanthropic transformation or animal behavior. The second is psychiatric, the argument that the belief itself, the sincere conviction that one is or can become a wolf, is a symptom of specific mental illness or psychological states, and that this belief can drive behavior that is destructive and dangerous. On the medical side, the most frequently cited condition in relation to werewolf belief is a group of rare genetic disorders collectively known as the porphyrias. Porphyria is a metabolic disorder affecting the production of heme, a component of hemoglobin, and it occurs in several forms with different symptoms. The most severe forms of porphyria can produce a range of symptoms including extreme sensitivity to sunlight, causing blistering of the skin and recession of the gums and lips in ways that can give the face a gaunt, fawn-like appearance, neurological symptoms including seizures and psychotic episodes, and in some cases hypertrichosis, an abnormal growth of hair on the face and body. The hypothesis that porphyria underlies many historical werewolf accounts was advanced most prominently by biochemist David Dolphin in a 1985 paper presented to the American Association for the Advancement of Science, which generated considerable popular press attention. The porphyria hypothesis is interesting and has been taken seriously enough to receive sustained academic attention, but it has also been substantially criticized. The specific combination of symptoms required to produce anything resembling the classical werewolf description is extremely rare, and the geographical and temporal distribution of porphyria cases does not obviously map onto the distribution of werewolf accusations in the historical record. Moreover, as folklorists and historians of medicine have pointed out, the werewolf of the trial records is not described as physically deformed in ways consistent with porphyria. The accused are not typically described as having sun-damaged skin or abnormal facial features before their alleged transformation. The porphyria hypothesis is perhaps best understood as a plausible contributing factor in some individual cases rather than as a general explanation for the widespread cultural phenomenon of werewolf belief. Hypertrichosis itself, a condition of excessive hair growth across the body or face, sometimes called werewolf syndrome in popular discourse, has been documented in the medical literature as a rare genetic condition. Historical individuals with pronounced hypertrichosis were sometimes exhibited as curiosities, as documented in accounts from early modern Europe, and it is possible that encounters with such individuals contributed to localized werewolf beliefs. But hypertrichosis is itself extremely rare, and again the geographical distribution of the condition does not explain the distribution of the belief. Rabies has been suggested by some researchers as a possible biological foundation for some aspects of werewolf belief. Rabies, transmitted through the bite of an infected animal, produces in its advanced stages a cluster of symptoms that include extreme agitation, aggression, hydrophobia, altered behavior, and in some cases the desire to bite. The behavioral transformation it produces in infected animals, a normally shy fox becoming aggressive and approaching humans, a domestic dog turning on its owners, is dramatic and frightening, and the neurological effects of the disease in human beings are severe. The idea that witnessing the behavioral transformation of a rabies-infected person or animal might contribute to or reinforce existing beliefs about lycanthropic transformation has been developed by scholars including Juan Gómez Alonso, whose 1998 paper in the journal Neurology drew connections between rabies symptomatology and vampire and werewolf belief. The argument is suggestive but, like the porphyria hypothesis, does not fully account for the cultural distribution or the specific characteristics of documented werewolf belief. Ergotism, a condition caused by consuming grain contaminated with the ergot fungus, which produces compounds related to LSD and can cause powerful hallucinations, convulsions and altered states of consciousness, has been proposed as a contributing factor in several specific witch trial panics, most notably by Linda Caporale in her 1976 paper connecting ergot contamination with the Salem witch trials. Whether ergotism played a role in specific werewolf cases is difficult to determine from the surviving record, but the general point, that contaminated food supplies in pre-modern agricultural communities could produce community-wide hallucinatory experiences, is a legitimate consideration in thinking about the conditions under which werewolf beliefs might be activated or intensified. The psychiatric literature on what is now termed clinical lycanthropy is considerably more robust and more directly relevant to understanding the phenomenon than any of the medical hypotheses. Clinical lycanthropy is defined in the psychiatric literature as a rare condition in which a person holds the delusional belief that they have transformed or can transform into an animal. It is not a formal diagnosis in the DSM-5 or ICD-11. It is considered a symptom or a specific delusional presentation that can occur in the context of several different underlying psychiatric conditions, but it has been documented in case reports in the psychiatric literature since the 19th century and has received sustained clinical attention. The first systematic modern clinical description of lycanthropy as a psychiatric phenomenon was provided by the German physician R. Keck in 1856, but the case literature grew significantly through the 20th century. Paul Keck and colleagues at McLean Hospital published what remains one of the most cited reviews of the clinical lycanthropy literature in 1988, in a paper in the Journal of Clinical Psychiatry, in which they analyzed 12 cases of patients who reported believing they were transforming into animals. Of those 12, the animals involved included wolves, dogs, cats, rabbits, tigers, and birds, suggesting that the specific identification with the wolf, while culturally prominent, is not the only or even the necessarily most common focus of lycanthropic delusion. The underlying diagnoses in those 12 cases included bipolar disorder with psychotic features, schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, and drug-induced psychosis. The clinical picture of lycanthropy as documented in the psychiatric literature involves several consistent features. The patient typically experiences their transformation as real and not as metaphorical. They may adopt quadrupedal postures, growl or howl, attempt to bite, refuse food offered in human contexts while accepting raw meat or food from the floor, and express fear or distress about their animal identity. The experience can be episodic, occurring during acute psychotic breaks and remitting during periods of stability, or it can be persistent. It is consistently distressing to the patient, and it can lead to dangerous behavior. The relationship between these modern clinical cases and the historical werewolf accounts is a matter of some scholarly delicacy. It would be reductive and probably incorrect to argue that all historical werewolf cases were simply unrecognized instances of clinical lycanthropy, schizophrenia, or other psychiatric conditions. The cultural frameworks that shaped how people in different historical periods understood and expressed unusual mental states were profoundly different from our own, and the experience of a psychotic episode in 16th-century rural Germany would be interpreted, expressed, and acted upon in ways that reflect the cultural resources available to that person, the theological concepts, the folk beliefs, the social expectations, in ways that are not simply translatable into modern psychiatric categories. But the clinical literature does provide genuine evidence that the experience of believing oneself to be an animal, with all the behavioral and perceptual changes that can accompany psychotic belief, is a real human experience, documented in clinical settings, and that it produces behaviors that would be, in a pre-modern cultural context, entirely consistent with what the historical record describes. The psychiatrist Leonard Zussin and psychologist Warren Jones, in their study Animalistic Psychology, as well as anthropologist Mircea Eliade in his foundational work on shamanism, have both contributed frameworks for understanding the connection between altered states of consciousness, whether produced by mental illness, by deliberate shamanic practice, by fasting, sleep deprivation, or other means, and the reported experience of animal transformation. The shaman's experience of animal transformation, as described in ethnographic accounts from Siberia, the Americas, and elsewhere, involves genuine alterations of perception and self-experience that are culturally contextualized as transformation rather than delusion. The line between the shaman's controlled, culturally sanctioned experience of animal identity and the psychiatric patient's uncontrolled, distressing delusion of the same kind is not a line between real and imaginary experience, but a line between culturally integrated and culturally pathologized experience. Both involve real changes in the subjective experience of selfhood and body. The difference is in how the surrounding community interprets and responds to those changes. The forensic psychiatric literature adds another layer to the analysis, because some historical werewolf cases, and in particular the most violent ones like the Stumpp case and the Garnier case, involve not just the belief in transformation but actual predatory violence against human beings, particularly children. The profile of an individual who commits serial predatory violence, targets vulnerable victims, and in some cases engages in behavior resembling or including cannibalism is one that modern forensic psychiatry recognizes as consistent with several serious psychiatric conditions as well as with certain forms of severe personality disorder. Whether the lycanthropic framing in such cases represented a genuine belief by the accused, a narrative imposed by interrogators, a post hoc rationalization, or some combination of all three cannot be determined from the surviving records. But the overlap between the documented behavioral profile and what modern forensic psychiatry would recognize as serious violent pathology is clear. What the medical and psychiatric literature, taken as a whole, tells us about the werewolf is this: the transformation is not physical. The body does not change its nature. But the experience of being something other than human, of inhabiting an animal identity, of moving through the world as a predator rather than as a social being, is a real and documented feature of human psychology, occurring across cultures and across time, expressing itself through the cultural frameworks available to the person who experiences it, and sometimes manifesting in behavior that is genuinely dangerous to others. The werewolf that the modern world knows, the creature of cinema, of paperback fiction, of television and comic books and Halloween costumes, is a product of a media tradition that began in the 19th century and accelerated dramatically through the 20th. It draws on the historical and folkloric traditions that have been described throughout this documentary, but it selects from, amplifies, and fundamentally reshapes those traditions in ways that have created a figure substantially different from anything in the pre-modern record. The 19th century Gothic literary tradition was crucial in establishing the werewolf as a figure of serious imaginative literature. The short story form was particularly hospitable to werewolf narratives, and several important 19th century werewolf stories draw explicitly on the folkloric and theological traditions of earlier centuries while reworking them for a romantic and post-romantic audience. Frederick Marryat's The White Wolf of the Harz Mountains, published in 1839 as part of the novel The Phantom Ship, drew on German folk tradition and presented the werewolf as a figure of tragic transgression rooted in sexual danger and family corruption. George W. M. Reynolds's Wagner the Werewolf, serialized in 1846 and 1847, was a Gothic melodrama of considerable popularity that brought the werewolf to a mass audience of readers who consumed serialized fiction. Sutherland Menzies' short story Hughes, the Werewolf, published in 1838, is notable for being one of the earliest English-language werewolf stories to engage explicitly with the historical and folkloric record, drawing on French traditions and presenting the werewolf in a specifically historical setting. These 19th-century literary treatments established several conventions that would prove durable. The werewolf as a figure of tragic doubleness, living a normal human life while carrying a terrible secret. The transformation as a loss of control, a surrender of reason to animal instinct. And the werewolf as a figure that evokes sympathy as well as horror, because it is, at some level, a victim of its own condition. The early 20th century saw the werewolf begin its transition from literary creature to cinematic one. The German expressionist cinema of the 1920s produced several films engaging with transformation and monstrosity, though the specific figure of the werewolf arrived in American cinema somewhat later. The 1935 Universal film Werewolf of London, directed by Stuart Walker and starring Henry Hull, is often cited as the first major Hollywood werewolf film, and it established several visual conventions: the partial transformation, the humanoid wolf figure, the emphasis on the tragic human dimension of the curse, that would influence subsequent films. It was Universal's 1941 film The Wolf Man, directed by George Wagner and starring Lon Chaney Jr., that definitively shaped the popular understanding of the werewolf for the mid-20th century and beyond. The Wolf Man introduced or consolidated several elements that are now considered fundamental to the popular werewolf mythology: the full moon as the trigger for transformation, silver as the specific material capable of killing the werewolf, the bite as the mechanism of transmission from one person to another, and the tragic framing of the werewolf as a fundamentally decent person destroyed by a condition they did not choose and cannot control. Of these elements, as has been discussed, only the bite as a transmission mechanism has significant roots in pre-modern folk tradition. The full moon as transformation trigger and silver as the specific killing agent were not prominent features of the documented historical record before the 20th century film tradition made them so. The screenwriter for The Wolf Man was Kurt Siodmak, a German Jewish refugee who had fled Nazi Germany in 1933. Siodmak himself acknowledged in later interviews that he largely invented the mythology of the film, the rules about silver bullets, the moon, the transmission by bite, and that he was not drawing primarily on any specific folk tradition. The influence of this invented mythology on subsequent popular culture has been, by almost any measure, greater than the influence of the entire pre-modern historical record combined. It is one of the more striking examples in cultural history of a single creative work reshaping a mythology that had been developing for thousands of years. Subsequent decades saw the werewolf become a staple figure of horror genre fiction and film, with treatments ranging from the serious and psychologically nuanced to the purely commercial. John Landis's An American Werewolf in London, released in 1981, engaged directly with the folk tradition by using it as a narrative frame while fundamentally subverting the conventions established by Universal, presenting the transformation as physically violent and deeply traumatic rather than dramatically graceful. The film's special effects, created by Rick Baker, transformed the cinematic language for depicting lycanthropic transformation and set a new standard that subsequent films were measured against. The literary werewolf of the 20th and 21st centuries has ranged from genre horror to serious literary fiction. Stephen King's novel cycle of The Werewolf, published in 1983, returned the werewolf to its roots as a community-destroying predator. Angela Carter's short story The Company of Wolves, published in her 1979 collection The Bloody Chamber, used werewolf mythology as a vehicle for examining gender, sexuality, and the dangers and freedoms of the body in ways that drew explicitly on the folk tradition Carter had studied as a writer and scholar of folklore. Carter's work represents one of the most intellectually serious engagements with the folkloric and historical tradition in 20th century literature, and her treatment of the werewolf as a figure that simultaneously embodies danger and freedom, violence and liberation, reflects a genuine engagement with what the historical sources actually show. Television and young adult fiction of the late 20th and early 21st centuries have further transformed the werewolf into something quite different from its historical antecedents. A figure who can be sympathetic, romantic, and even aspirational, whose transformation represents not corruption but power, not damnation but identity. This trajectory, from the divine punishment of Lycaon to the romantic anti-hero of contemporary popular fiction, is a remarkable arc across more than 3,000 years of cultural history, and it says something important about how different historical periods have needed the werewolf to mean different things. The werewolf's persistence into the 21st century, across so many different media, cultural contexts, and artistic traditions, is not simply a function of genre inertia or commercial convenience. It reflects the continuing relevance of the questions that werewolf mythology has always been organized around. What is the boundary between the human and the animal? What happens when that boundary fails? What is the relationship between the individual and the predatory violence that may exist within them? What does it mean to live in a community that contains hidden dangers? People who appear normal but are not, who carry within them a capacity for destruction that their everyday social presentation conceals. These questions are not abstract. They are questions that human beings confront in concrete ways in every generation, and the werewolf remains a useful symbolic vehicle for exploring them precisely because it is ancient enough to carry the weight of historical tradition while flexible enough to be adapted to contemporary concerns. The academic study of werewolf mythology has itself matured considerably over the past century. The early 20th century scholarship of figures like Sabine Baring-Gould, whose 1865 book The Book of Werewolves compiled an extensive survey of werewolf traditions across cultures, was valuable as a collecting enterprise but was sometimes uncritical in its treatment of sources and overly eager to find a single unified mythology underlying diverse traditions. Later scholarship, including the work of Carlo Ginzburg on the Thiess case and on the broader phenomenon of folk belief in nocturnal spirit battles, the meticulous historical work of scholars like Rolf Schult on German werewolf trials, and the anthropological analyses of animal transformation beliefs by researchers like David Gordon White, whose 2021 study Rakshasa, India's supernatural man-eaters explores parallel traditions in South Asian mythology, has produced a much more nuanced and culturally specific picture of how werewolf beliefs actually functioned in different historical and social contexts. The feminist scholarship of the late 20th and early 21st centuries has contributed important analysis of the gender dimensions of werewolf mythology, noting the ways in which the masculine werewolf of the trial record and the literary tradition encode specific fears about male violence, about the animal within the human male, and about the failure of civilization's constraints to contain that violence. Scholars including Marina Warner, in her wide-ranging analyses of fairy tale and myth, have explored how the shape-shifting figure in general serves as a vehicle for cultural anxieties about identity, gender, and the body. Post-colonial scholarship has brought important critical attention to the ways in which European colonizers and anthropologists applied the werewolf framework, and related concepts of animalistic savagery, to the peoples they encountered and subjugated, and how the concept of the shapeshifter was used to code indigenous traditions as primitive and threatening in ways that served colonial power. The analysis of skinwalker beliefs by scholars working within or in close collaboration with Native American communities has pushed back against the appropriation and sensationalization of those beliefs in popular culture, insisting on the importance of cultural context and community authority in how such traditions are understood and discussed. In contemporary popular culture, the werewolf has become part of a broader ecosystem of supernatural beings, alongside vampires, witches, ghosts, and other figures, that circulates through film, television, fiction, gaming, and online fan culture. The figure has been adapted to serve narratives about identity formation, about the experience of marginalization and difference, about the tension between social conformity and authentic selfhood. In young adult fiction and in much genre television, the werewolf's transformation is reframed as a coming-of-age metaphor, an externalization of the experience of adolescent body change, emotional volatility, and the discovery of inner capacities, not all of them comfortable, that were not visible before. This reframing is a long way from Peter Stumpp. It is a long way from Thiess of Kaltenbrun. It is a long way from the frightened communities of rural Germany and France who believed that something was hunting them in the dark. But it is connected to all of those things by a continuous thread of cultural transmission, a thread that runs from the cuneiform tablets of ancient Mesopotamia through the Greek myths of divine punishment, through the Norse sagas of warrior transformation, through the torture chambers of early modern Europe, through the medical case files of 19th century asylums, and into the multiplex cinema and the streaming television platform of the 21st century. The specific fears change. The specific cultural work the werewolf is asked to do changes. But something in the figure itself, something about the idea of the human who contains the animal, about the person who appears safe but is not, about the fragility of the self that civilization has built over the wild thing underneath, continues to find resonance. That resonance is not arbitrary. It is grounded in something real about the human condition. The capacity for predatory violence is not something that civilization has eliminated from the human animal. It is something that civilization has constrained, redirected, channeled, and in some cases simply driven underground. The werewolf, in all its historical forms, is a figure that acknowledges this. It says, in the language appropriate to whatever culture is telling the story, the danger is real. It is not only outside the village. It is also inside it. It may be wearing a human face. And it may not be possible to tell until it is too late, which is the face it was born with. The werewolf has been with us for a very long time. Longer, probably, than any of us quite realize when we encounter the figure in its modern, commercially packaged forms. It was old when Ovid wrote about Lycaon. It was old when the Norse skalds composed their sagas of wolfskin warriors. It was already embedded in the legal and theological machinery of early modern Europe with a thoroughness that suggests centuries of prior accumulation, layer upon layer of belief, tradition, fear, and social function. What the historical record shows, across all its diversity of cultural context, linguistic medium, time period, and interpretive framework, is that the werewolf is not simply a monster. It is a question. Or rather, it is a set of questions that human societies have been asking themselves in the form of a story for more than 4,000 years. Questions about what makes a person human, and what might unmake them. Questions about where the animal ends and the person begins, and whether that line is as clear as we would like to believe. Questions about violence, its origins, its nature, its relationship to the social structures we build to contain it. Questions about identity and its stability, about the self and whether it can be trusted to remain what it has always been. The people who were tried as werewolves in 16th and 17th century Europe, Peter Stumpp in Bedburg, Gilles Garnier in Franche-Comté, Thiess in Livonia, the nameless dozens of others whose trial records survive in fragmented form in archives across the continent, were real human beings. Whatever they believed, whatever they did or did not do, whatever the truth of their individual cases may have been, they were caught up in a machinery of belief and fear and institutional power that transformed them into something the culture needed them to be. They became the answer to a question their communities were asking. They became the explanation for violence, for loss, for the terrible things that can happen to people in an uncontrolled world. The werewolf served that explanatory function for centuries because it was a better explanation from the perspective of the communities that used it than the available alternatives. It was better than saying, "The world is dangerous and the danger has no name and no face and cannot be caught." It was better than saying, "The person who killed those children was a person who looked like us and lived among us and we did not know." The werewolf gave the danger a shape. It gave it a mechanism, the pact, the girdle, the ointment, the curse. It gave it a solution, the trial, the confession, the execution, the public burning that made the community safe again, or at least feel safe. And the psychiatric literature tells us that the werewolf also served another function, closer to the interior of individual human experience. The person who believes they are becoming a wolf, who experiences, with all the reality that psychotic experience can carry, the sense of the human self dissolving into something wilder and more dangerous, that person is expressing something in the only language available to them. Something about a self that no longer coheres. Something about impulses that cannot be contained by the usual social machinery. Something about a fundamental rupture in the experience of being a person among other persons. Clinical lycanthropy, rare as it is real. It is documented. It is treated. And it is a reminder that the werewolf's deepest roots are not in theology or folklore or legal history but in the most intimate and most frightening depths of human psychological experience. What persists, across all the centuries and all the cultural transformations, is the core of the myth. The idea that the human and the animal coexist within the same body, within the same person, separated by a boundary that is thinner than it should be. The idea that under sufficient pressure, a curse, a pact, a disease, a trauma, the right moon on the wrong night, that boundary might fail. The idea that the face looking back from the mirror might not always be entirely human. This is not a comfortable idea. But it is, the historical record suggests, a deeply and persistently human one. We have been telling ourselves this story for as long as we have been telling stories at all. We have been frightened by it, organized our communities around it, prosecuted and executed people because of it, and found in it a language for experiences, psychological, social, physical, that resist easier description. The werewolf endures not because we cannot think of anything scarier. It endures because it is about something true. Not true in the sense that people physically transform into wolves under the light of the full moon, but true in the sense that the human being is not simply a rational animal who has fully mastered its own nature, that the capacity for violence and destruction lives alongside the capacity for reason and love in the same body, that the civilized self is real but it is not the whole story. That is what the historical record of the werewolf, read carefully and taken seriously, ultimately shows us. Not a creature of fantasy, though fantasy has made excellent use of it. Not a relic of superstition that rationalism has permanently defeated, though rationalism has substantially transformed how we talk about it. But a figure that names something true, in the darkest and most careful sense of that word, about what it is to be human, about what we contain, about what we fear in ourselves and in each other, and in the darkness beyond the firelight that has never, in all the centuries of recorded human history, entirely gone away.